Imagine yourself walking slowly along a gravel path in the early morning, beneath a sky still shrouded in mist. The garden you pass is neatly kept, but the roses seem just a bit too perfect, as though trimmed by someone instructed never to err. Ivy creeps up the high stone walls that flank you, whispering around the window panes above like something half alive. You are approaching a building that is both stately and unsettling in its symmetry. This is a Victorian asylum, its bricks darkened by damp, its chimneys quietly exhaling the soft breath of a building already awake. Inside, the day is beginning, if it ever truly ended. Somewhere, a bell has just rung. Not a church bell, but the familiar metal clang of an institutional chime, signalling the start of morning rounds. The corridors stretch long and echoing, lined with wooden wainscoting and walls painted in dull, calming shades of green. A soft, rhythmic shuffle of keys accompanies your steps. The air smells faintly of boiled oats, carbolic soap, and something older, a memory of damp paper and wax polish, never quite lifted. This is not a story about the patients, though their presence is a constant background hum in these halls. Instead, we turn our attention to the ones who worked here, the attendants, the night keepers, the nurses in stiff aprons and laced boots, the cooks, the cleaners, the gardeners, and the quiet clerks who signed the intake papers. Their lives unfolded in the spaces between alarm bells, whispered prayers, and the unchanging ticking of an old institutional clock. In the next 2 hours, we will walk alongside them. We will learn what it truly meant to work in a Victorian mental hospital, not as a patient, but as part of the staff that held the system together. Each segment will gently lead you through daily routines, forgotten biographies, architectural curiosities, medical curiosities, and social contrasts. You may drift off. That's perfectly fine. Let the rhythm of their lives lull you. Let the quiet footfalls and morning routines carry you through sleep. We begin with a soft step forward into the world of a Victorian asylum worker, a world where silence was expected, but never quite achieved. Let us begin. The day begins before the sun rises. You are expected to be at the gates by 5:30 in the morning. The iron fence is cold beneath your glove, the latch sticky with old paint. A uniformed porter nods at you without speaking. The gravel crunches beneath your boots as you cross the courtyard, the fog curling around your ankles. By 6, you are already inside. The air is warm but close, and smells of linseed oil and starch. You exchange a glance with another attendant, neither of you quite awake, both of you carrying the weight of what lies ahead. Your first task, unlocking the sleeping wards. Each door requires a different key. You carry them on a leather strap looped through your belt, and the sound of them announces your presence long before you arrive. The key ring is heavy, not just in weight but in symbolism. Keys mean control, but they also mean responsibility. As you step into the women's ward, the room is still dark. The beds are arranged in neat rows, with narrow aisles between them. Some of the patients are already stirring. One is humming a hymn under her breath. Another stares silently at the ceiling, eyes wide, unmoving. You nod to the nurse already stationed at the far end of the room. She is sitting with her back straight, hands folded neatly on her lap. She has not slept. Your task is to begin the waking process. Not all patients will rise willingly. Some will resist, some will weep, and a few will pretend to sleep through your presence entirely. You learn to distinguish the genuinely still from the deliberately motionless. You speak in a calm, even tone, loud enough to be heard, but not enough to startle. By 7, the ward is alive. There are basins to fill with water, nightclothes to collect, chamber pots to discreetly remove. The chamber pots are porcelain, with delicate painted patterns that do little to disguise their purpose. The scent is always strongest in the morning, before the windows are opened. You open one now, the sash sticking slightly in its frame. Cold air seeps in. Breakfast is served precisely at 8. You help usher the patients into the dining hall, guiding them gently but firmly. One of them insists she is the queen. She will only sit if given the chair by the window. You allow it, a small concession. The kitchen has prepared porridge, slightly over-salted, and tea that smells faintly metallic from the urns. You help distribute the trays, and then, as is required, you observe. You are not here to eat. You are here to ensure that each patient eats theirs. A woman begins to rock back and forth, gently knocking her spoon against the edge of the tin tray. Tap, tap, tap. The sound is rhythmic, oddly soothing, until it isn't. A nurse walks over, rests a hand on the woman's shoulder, and the tapping stops. For now. Mid-morning brings the first episode. A man in the men's ward refuses to be washed. He lashes out when the attendant brings a cloth near his face. You hear the raised voices from across the courtyard. You know better than to go. 2 attendants are already assigned to him. You remain with the others, leading them toward the workrooms where they will spend the next hour carding wool or folding bandages. The work is repetitive, and that is the point. Routine calms, repetition soothes. That is the theory, at least. But for you, the repetition wears thin. It is still only 10 in the morning. By noon, your back aches. You have walked 3 miles without leaving the building. You have spoken softly more times than you can count. You have calmed, cajoled, escorted, and corrected. You have nodded, reassured, and politely ignored the same question posed 15 times in the same phrasing. Lunch comes and goes. You eat in the staff room, where conversation is minimal. No one discusses the patients. No one discusses much at all. The tea is strong, the bread is dry, and the window in the break room does not open. The afternoon brings cleaning duties, more rounds, and the ever-present possibility of an incident. A scream from the east wing, a fight in the laundry, a patient missing from roll call. The building absorbs these disturbances like an old sponge, then settles back into quiet. By the time your shift ends at 6, the corridors are shadowed again. The gas lamps flicker slightly, casting soft halos against the tiled floor. Your keys are lighter now, many doors locked once more. You remove the ring from your belt, hand it to the evening porter, and walk slowly toward the gate. You will return tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. It is a job few keep for long. The hours are long, the tasks thankless, the pay minimal, and yet someone must be here. Imagine yourself walking out of the gate now, the night pressing close around you, the faint clatter of dinner trays echoing behind you. This is what it was like to work in a Victorian asylum, not for a moment, but for a lifetime. Imagine a woman dressed in plain grey wool, her bonnet neatly tied, her boots modestly laced, walking with steady purpose through the stone corridors of an unfamiliar building. The walls are bare, the air still and close. A long hallway stretches before her, its end hidden in shadows. Her gloved hand rests lightly on the banister as she descends a stairway into the basement. There is no one to guide her. No formal tour has been arranged. But Dorothea Lynn Dix is not here as a guest. She is here to observe. The year is 1841, and the building is not yet called an asylum. It is known simply as a house of correction. Inside its low, damp cells, she finds men and women lying on straw. There are no windows. There are no beds. Some of the residents are chained to the walls. Others are naked. All of them are quiet, though not by choice. Their silence is the silence of despair, of exhaustion, of abandonment. Dorothea is not a nurse. She is not a physician. She is a school teacher. But this moment, this quiet, shivering descent into the dark will change the course of her life. Over the next 4 decades, she will devote herself entirely to the cause of mental health reform. Her mission will span nearly every state in the United States, and eventually several countries abroad. She will write, she will lobby, she will plead before Congress, and she will be received in royal courts. But through it all, her method will remain the same. She visits, she listens, she documents, and then she returns with evidence in hand. Dorothea Dix was born in Maine in 1802 into a household marked by instability. Her father was often absent and frequently unemployed. Her mother was ill. As a young girl, Dorothea found refuge in books and order. She began teaching at the age of 14. By the time she reached 39, she had established several small schools and written a number of educational texts. But it was her volunteer work at the East Cambridge jail that opened her eyes to a reality she had never imagined. People with mental illnesses were not being treated, they were being hidden. Her report to the Massachusetts legislature in 1843 was methodical, detailed, and unflinching. She described the conditions of dozens of jails, almshouses, and private homes. She included names, dates, numbers. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. Her writing was simple, precise, and quietly devastating. And it worked. Massachusetts allocated funding for the expansion of the state's mental hospital in Worcester. Other states began to follow. She traveled to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and beyond. Each time, she walked through new corridors, took new notes, and returned to state officials with quiet insistence. She was tireless, unmarried, without children. She wrote hundreds of letters each month, in a neat, sloping hand. She refused payment. She refused personal publicity. Her cause was simple, that those with mental illness should not be punished, but cared for. By the 1850s, Dorothea Dix had become a known figure in reform circles, but she remained largely outside the traditional institutions of power. She had no official position, she carried no title, and still she succeeded. Her influence extended to Europe. She visited Scotland and Ireland. She toured institutions in France and Italy. She met with Pope Pius IX, who, impressed by her compassion and diligence, ordered the construction of a new hospital in Rome. And yet, Dorothea never lost her sense of solitude. In letters to her few close friends, she often described the weight of her work, the cold rooms, the blank stares, the endless journeys by carriage. Her life was one of quiet sacrifice. During the American Civil War, she accepted the position of Superintendent of Army Nurses for the Union Army. It was her first and only formal appointment. She oversaw thousands of volunteers, insisting on discipline, order, and minimal emotional involvement. Many younger nurses found her stern and distant, but she kept the hospitals running. After the war, she returned to her mission. By the time she passed away in 1887, she had helped establish or expand more than 30 institutions across the United States. Today, her name is rarely spoken. Her face, if encountered at all, appears in black and white portraits a severe expression, hair parted in the center, eyes set with purpose. But in countless archives, her handwritten reports remain, still legible, still precise. Her work did not create utopias. Victorian asylums were still flawed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. But they were a beginning, a structure, a system, and most of all, a recognition that those suffering from mental illness were human. Imagine her now, stepping once again into a dark corridor, her footsteps measured, her notebook tucked beneath her arm. She is not a saint, she is not a savior, she is simply determined, and she will not stop walking. At the edge of London, where the fog lingered thickest along the Thames, there stood a building older than most of the city itself. Its facade was elegant in a heavy sort of way, stone columns, wrought iron gates, and a wide gravel court that muffled footsteps. Above its entrance, carved in stone, were the letters that had come to symbolize both care and cruelty, Bethlehem Royal Hospital. But to most, it was simply Bedlam. Bedlam is a word that lingers in the English language, its meaning now synonymous with chaos. But once, it was a place, a real building, a structure with walls, rooms, locks, and curiously a clock. The Bedlam clock did not mark time like ordinary clocks. Its presence, recorded in visitor accounts from the 18th and early 19th centuries, was both literal and symbolic. And yet, no plans remain to show where it was placed. No drawing offers its exact design, and no mechanism survives to explain how it functioned. Its riddle lies in its absence. A clock, once there now gone. But we know this. The clock chimed, not on the hour, but at intervals dictated by routine. The first bell of the day rang shortly after dawn, not when the sun rose, but when the patients were to be roused. Its second chime, at mid-morning, signalled the start of visitations when the public, for a small fee, could walk through the wards and observe the residents as one might observe exhibits in a museum. Later chimes marked mealtimes, medicine distributions, and evening lock-up. One bell was particularly soft, almost uncertain. It came mid-afternoon, when the staff took turns retreating to the small garden court for tea or quiet. Time in Bedlam was not measured in minutes or hours. It was measured in routine. Visitors often remarked on the sense of timelessness within its walls. The air was thick, the sounds muffled, the windows high and narrow. Some patients marked the passing days by scratching lines into the wood of their bed frames. Others sat perfectly still, as if frozen at the moment of their arrival. And yet the clock chimed, always just enough to remind those inside that the day moved forward. The staff, too, grew attuned to its rhythm. An attendant might pause in mid-task, sensing a chime about to sound. A nurse might prepare her tray a moment early, timing her actions not by the movement of hands on a dial, but by instinct. The chimes were not uniform in volume. Some days they rang strong and confident. Other days they seemed swallowed by the fog. No two people described the clock in the same way. One former keeper, interviewed years later, swore the clock had no face at all. Another, a visitor from the continent, claimed it bore Roman numerals fashioned in brass. A third described the sound of the bell as metallic and sour, like an anvil dropped in water. Was it a single clock, or several? Was it housed in the main building, or hidden within the tower annex? The records do not agree. But there is something else, something perhaps more mysterious. In the ledgers kept by Bedlam's stewards, the clock is not mentioned. Not once. The inventories list furniture, bedding, lanterns, basins, keys, even the number of teaspoons assigned to each ward. But no clock. Not under tools, not under fixtures, not under maintenance. And yet, it chimed. Its absence in the records has led some historians to wonder whether the Bedlam clock ever existed at all, or whether it was a shared illusion, a fiction born from routine, a phantom timekeeper conjured by the repetitive days, the predictable schedule, the eternal sameness. But if you walk the grounds today, what remains of them, that is, you may still sense it, the quiet intervals between one duty and the next, the long shadows cast by early evening, the rhythm of feet on flagstones, of doors opening and closing, of voices rising and falling in soft cadence. These are the echoes of institutional time. Whether the Bedlam clock was real or simply remembered into being, it held a power over those who worked beneath it. It regulated not just schedules, but breathing, not just actions, but thoughts. Imagine now the soft clang of a distant bell, not sharp, not urgent, a gentle chime, somewhere behind a door that no longer exists. The kind of sound you might hear in a dream just before waking or just before sleep. This was the riddle of the Bedlam clock. A timekeeper with no hands, a presence with no face. And still, it ticked. In a quiet room, lit only by the pale grey light filtering through a narrow window, a man sits behind a heavy wooden desk. Before him is a leather-bound ledger, its pages ruled with faint blue lines. Each line contains a name, a date, a note of origin, and beside that, a single word written in neat, slanted script. Lunatic, melancholic, maniacal. hysterical, puerperal, senile. These were not insults, these were categories. In the Victorian asylum, to be treated was first to be classified, and classification, like so many things of the time, was both carefully constructed and deeply flawed. The language of mental illness in the 19th century was rooted not in neuroscience, but in observation, intuition, and a heavy dose of social expectation. Terms like lunacy and melancholia were not simply descriptions, they were medical designations, legal designations, and often sentences. To be declared a lunatic was to be marked as irrational, unpredictable, disconnected from reality. The term implied a disordered mind, perhaps temporarily lost to fever, trauma, or spiritual confusion. A lunatic might shout nonsense at invisible beings, might wander the streets by night, might remove their clothes in public, or declare themselves a prophet. Melancholia, on the other hand, suggested a slow, sorrowful decline, a stillness, a soul weighed down by a sadness it could not articulate. The melancholic patient might sit in silence for days, refusing food, staring into nothing. Their voice was soft, their movements minimal, their presence barely felt. The two were not always easily distinguished. A patient might arrive labelled one and later be reassigned as the other. The labels shifted like weather. For women, classifications took on additional layers. A woman grieving after childbirth might be diagnosed with puerperal insanity, a condition now recognized as postpartum depression, but at the time seen as a disorder of the womb. Another might be labelled hysterical, a diagnosis so broad it encompassed everything from fainting spells to expressions of anger. Young women who defied their families were often sent to asylums not because they were ill, but because they were inconvenient. Their protests became symptoms, their resistance became pathology. Older men, too, were frequently miscategorized. A former labourer with early dementia might be written down as senile melancholic. A pensioner with persistent tremors might be mistaken for a lunatic. There were no brain scans, no lab tests, only observation, interpretation, and the sometimes tired, sometimes indifferent gaze of a clerk with a fountain pen. But it was not only the doctors and attendants who used these words. The patients themselves sometimes internalized their assigned categories. A man who had once shouted in anger might now whisper, "I am a melancholic." A woman who mourned the loss of her child might sign her name beneath the word hysteric in her own hand. There was no chart to determine treatment paths, there were no universal protocols. Some melancholic patients were given access to books and fresh air. Others were confined to narrow cells, expected to recover through silence. Lunatics might be prescribed rest, cold baths, and in some cases, physical restraint. But so too were the melancholic, the maniacal, the hysterical. In some asylums, there were separate wings for each category. These wings were not merely architectural, they were philosophical divisions, imagined lines between types of minds. Even within a single diagnosis, there were subcategories: acute melancholia, chronic mania, recurrent lunacy, moral insanity, a term reserved for those who appeared sane in every way, save for their stubborn refusal to conform. The terminology changed over time. What was once called mania became delirium. What had been labelled idiocy evolved into developmental delay. And yet, the drive to categorize remained. One physician, in an unpublished notebook, wrote, "We seek to name that which we do not understand. In naming, we do not master it, but we believe, for a moment, that we do." And so the ledgers filled. Page after page, ink soaking slowly into paper. Names and labels, diagnoses and dates. Some patients remained in one category for years. Others shifted back and forth like ghosts caught between definitions. In time, even the names faded, but the labels remained. Today, when these ledgers are opened in archives by gloved hands, in quiet rooms they still carry the weight of those words. lunatic, melancholic, hysterical, hopeless. They are not terms we use now. And yet, they echo. Imagine now the soft sound of a page turning, the faint scrape of pen against paper. A clerk writes, pauses, looks up through the small window, and somewhere down the hall, a patient stares at a wall, unaware of the word just written beside their name. The day began not with the sunrise, but with the clatter of keys. It was the sound that stirred the building from its uneasy rest. Before the gas lamps were turned down, before the patients stirred in their narrow beds, before the porridge began to bubble in the kitchen kettles, it was the keys that signalled life returning to the wards. Each morning the attendants would collect their ring of keys from the porter's desk. The ring was made of brass or iron, sometimes leather-bound to soften its weight. On it hung a dozen or more keys, each cut specifically for the rooms it opened, each slightly worn, slightly bent, shaped by years of use. The larger keys unlocked the heavy ward doors. The smaller ones were for linen closets, medicine cabinets, and storage chests. To carry the keys was to bear the quiet authority of routine. You were trusted, but you were also tethered. The keys were not just tools, they were symbols of division, of access and denial, of freedom for some, confinement for others. Imagine now a long hallway, dimly lit, stretching from one end of the building to the other. The floors are polished wood, scuffed by years of boots and wheels. On each side, tall doors line the walls, some labelled, some blank. As the first light of morning slips in through the high windows, the attendant walks slowly, stopping at each door in turn. Click, slide, open. Inside the ward, the air is thick from the night's stillness. The smell is a mixture of old bedding, human sweat, disinfectant, and candle wax. Most of the patients are still in bed, some murmuring in sleep, others lying awake and silent. The process begins gently. Curtains are drawn back, windows cracked open just a little to let in air but not chill. Chamber pots are collected with practiced discretion. Their contents are unspoken, their presence expected. Each is emptied, rinsed, and returned before breakfast. Then the real work of cleaning begins. Each bed is stripped sheets shaken out in the courtyard, aired briefly in the cold breeze, then folded back into tight squares. Straw mattresses are turned. Wooden floors are swept with stiff bristled brushes, the dust rising in slow spirals before settling again. Everything is touched, tended to, checked, and reordered. The wash basins, made of enamel or tin, are filled from tall kettles hauled in from the central boiler. The water is warm, but not hot. Soap is distributed brown and lye-heavy, harsh on the hands but effective on linen. Some patients wash themselves. Others are gently guided through the motions. Still others are wiped clean by attendants whose hands move with quiet precision. The towels are coarse, the cloths damp, the pace unhurried. There is little conversation. In the women's wards, a nurse might hum under her breath, the notes drifting above the quiet rustle of fabric. In the men's wards, the silence is deeper, broken only by coughs and the occasional clink of a basin set down. Every item in the ward has its place. The combs are hung on small brass hooks, each labelled with a number corresponding to a name in the register. The blankets are folded at the foot of each bed in exact triangles. The chairs are returned to their spots by the windows, angled to let in morning light without facing it directly. There is comfort in the repetition. To the patients, this routine is the architecture of the day. They know the sequence, they feel its rhythm. It is not always welcome, but it is familiar. And familiarity, in a place like this, is its own kind of medicine. For the staff too, the morning cleanings are a grounding ritual. It is a chance to observe quietly, to note small changes, a patient who refuses to rise, another who speaks for the first time in days. These are not written in official charts, but they are remembered. By the time the final ward is tidied, the hallway smells faintly of soap and steam. The floors are damp, gleaming. The beds are made. The patients are seated or pacing, or staring out the windows with unreadable expressions. The building feels almost calm. Almost. In the back of the building, the laundry begins its own process. A furnace stokes the heat for boiling linens. Ironing boards are set up in neat rows. The laundry women work without comment, their hands red from heat and soap. Back in the main wards, the bells begin again, signalling breakfast and the next part of the day. But for now, in this moment, everything is clean. The beds are made, the floors are swept, the air is fresher than it was an hour ago. The keys, for a while, are silent, resting on belts, clicking softly as their wearers move from room to room, ready to unlock whatever needs unlocking next. Imagine it now, the quiet echo of footsteps on damp wood, the gentle clink of keys, the faint scent of carbolic soap in the air. Another morning has begun in the Victorian Asylum. Beneath the wards, beyond the tiled corridors and past the storage rooms lined with shelves of linens and waxed boxes, the kitchens of the Victorian Asylum worked like a hidden heart. Early each morning, earlier than most would care to rise, the kitchen fires were lit. In the dark, before the clang of keys and the rustle of sheets, before even the faint sounds of patients stirring in their beds, a quiet chorus of chopping, stirring, and boiling had already begun. The kitchen itself was long and narrow, with stone floors and soot-blackened beams. Its walls were hung with heavy pots, ladles the length of a man's arm, and strainers shaped like little sieves of perforated tin. Light streamed in from high, barred windows, leaving slanted pools on the worn floorboards. The air was always warm, dense with the mingled scents of oats, onions, grease, and steam. In the colder months, the windows clouded with condensation, and the walls sweated quietly. Here, food was not just sustenance, it was rhythm, it was order, it was care made practical. The menus rarely changed. For breakfast, porridge thick, often salted, occasionally sweetened if molasses was available. With it came tea, strong and tannic, brewed in copper urns large enough to bathe a child. Bread followed, dense loaves cut into neat rectangles, served dry or with a smear of dripping. On Sundays, sometimes, an egg, not often. Lunch was the main meal of the day. Boiled beef or mutton, soft from long cooking, served with suet pudding or root vegetables. Potatoes were the staple, mashed when fresh, roasted when stored, stewed when old. Cabbage, too, figured heavily, chopped and boiled until its colour faded to a gentle green-grey. Dinner, or tea as it was sometimes called, was lighter. A bowl of broth, a heel of bread, sometimes cold meat from lunch, carefully portioned, occasionally cheese, though this was more common in smaller institutions. The staff ate separately. In rooms adjacent to the kitchen or tucked behind ward doors, they gathered around plain wooden tables, utensils laid in rows, conversation muted. Their meals were similar to the patients', though occasionally seasoned with a bit more care, a dash more salt, a fresher cut. The difference was small, but meaningful. In the main kitchen, the cooks moved steadily, silently. Their hands moved from basin to basin, slicing turnips, kneading dough, lifting lids. They did not rush. To rush was to risk inconsistency, and in a place like this, consistency was everything. Each ward had its own delivery time. Meals were wheeled along tile-floored corridors on carts with squeaky wheels and iron-rimmed trays. The sound of these carts became part of the day's soundscape, soft metal against stone, a gentle reminder that the hour had turned. Some patients waited quietly, bowls in hand, eyes lowered. Others needed coaxing or guidance, or, on difficult days, feeding. Still others refused altogether, and their trays returned untouched, noted discreetly in a notebook by the nurse on duty. The staff watched not just how the food was eaten, but if it was eaten. A patient who stopped eating for 2 days was quietly flagged. 3 days, and they were moved to a smaller room, where attendants could sit close, coaxing spoonfuls one at a time. Food was more than nourishment. It was behavior. It was health. It was proof that the mind had not turned entirely inward. In the kitchens, the talk was often of supplies, of when the next flour delivery would arrive, of how many pounds of barley would be needed for Sunday stew, of a broken ladle, a cracked pan, a shipment of eggs gone bad in the sun. The head cook kept a logbook, its pages filled with tallies, dates, and careful notes on spoilage. Beside it, a board listed weekly quantities: 40 pounds of mutton, 6 sacks of oats, 12 barrels of potatoes. The handwriting was small, precise, and unfailingly neat. There were moments of quiet pride, too, when the pudding set just right, when a patient smiled after the first sip of warm broth, when the tea urns were polished until they gleamed in the afternoon light. These moments were not celebrated aloud, but felt in the shared nods between workers. In some asylums, gardens supplied herbs and greens for the kitchens, mint for teas, parsley for garnish, leeks for the soup pots. These were small touches but meaningful, a trace of life from outside, a reminder of colour and growth. Not all food was met with gratitude. Some patients distrusted the meals. They whispered of poison, of watching eyes. For these, attendants offered extra care, tasting a spoonful first, offering reassurance in quiet tones. And there were patients who hoarded, tucking crusts into sleeves, hiding bits of bread beneath pillows. The staff allowed it, within reason. Everyone understood that hunger took many forms, not all of them visible. By evening, the kitchen settled into stillness. The pots were scrubbed, the counters wiped, the hearth embers left glowing under ash. A lone cook would remain, tending the next morning's oats, stirring slowly in the warm hush of the falling night. Feeding the mind here meant feeding the body first, simply, repetitively, with care. And so the cycle continued. Imagine the soft clatter of spoons, the steam rising from tin bowls, the quiet hush of hunger answered not with indulgence, but with reliability. In the kitchens of the asylum, time was served in meals, and every day the next began again. In the locked cupboard behind the matron's desk, where only a few carried the key, were the tools of last resort. They were rarely spoken of aloud, and when they were retrieved it was done with little ceremony, not out of cruelty, but out of custom. In the Victorian asylum, such objects were not seen as punishments. They were understood as necessary tools, interventions, instruments in the service of order. And above all else, the asylum valued order. The first of these tools was the restraint chair. Built of hardwood, often oak, it resembled an ordinary armchair at a glance, but closer inspection revealed the wide leather straps affixed to each arm and leg. The back was tall, its slats reinforced. A padded headrest was sometimes included, fastened not for comfort, but for control. Patients placed in the chair were meant to remain still, not for punishment, but for calming, for observation, for safety. Next came the camisole, what would later be known more commonly as the straitjacket. It was made of canvas or heavy linen, sometimes lined with a softer fabric. The arms crossed over the chest and buckled behind the back, the closures reinforced with leather patches. When worn, it prevented the wearer from striking out, from self-harm, from flight. It was not easy to apply. It required 2 attendants, sometimes 3, and it was not to be left on indefinitely. The rules said as much. But the rules were often stretched by fatigue, by fear, or simply by the quiet logic of necessity. There were mittens, too, soft padded gloves secured at the wrist, used to prevent scratching or clawing, less severe, more discreet. And then there was the cold bath. Unlike the warm morning wash basins, the cold bath was not for hygiene. It was intended to shock, to jar the mind back from disarray. The water was kept near freezing, drawn from underground cisterns or stone basins cooled overnight. A patient would be lowered slowly into it, restrained if necessary, held for a prescribed number of minutes. No screaming, no thrashing. The room was kept silent, the windows high and barred. The effect was rarely curative, but it was thought to settle the nerves. Some asylums had shower chairs, with water descending from overhead pipes. The patient would sit beneath the stream, fully clothed or not, depending on the prescription. These chairs were often made of perforated iron to allow drainage. The water was cold, always cold. Leaching and cupping were falling out of fashion by the middle Victorian period, though they lingered in some provincial institutions. A handful of physicians still believed in the balancing of humours, in drawing out agitation through small incisions. But newer ideas were replacing old ones. Electric therapy, for instance, began to appear in some asylums. Not the violent shocks of the later 20th century, but mild currents applied through handheld devices, metal wands connected by cords to battery boxes. The sensation was tingling, not painful. A gentle buzzing meant to stimulate the nerves. It was often applied to the temples, the wrists, the base of the spine. Many believed it invigorated the brain, cleared stagnant energy, reset the mind. And there were other tools, less physical but no less controlling. Seclusion rooms, padded or not, offered silence and solitude. The doors were thick, often lined with felt or leather. A small window near the top allowed observation. Inside, a mattress on the floor, a blanket, nothing else. Patients could spend hours there, or days. The record books called them episodes. A patient became unmanageable. A restraint was applied. A bath administered. A room secured. The language was always the same, measured, emotionless, orderly. But among the staff, there was quiet unease. Most did not enjoy using these tools. They followed protocols, yes, but they were not blind to the discomfort, the fear, the humanity that pulsed beneath each outburst. Some attendants muttered apologies beneath their breath as they fastened straps. Some nurses kept extra blankets for the cold rooms. Some whispered soft reassurances, even when the patient could not understand them. There were debates, quiet ones, in corners of the staff room, about the frequency of restraints, about the necessity of cold baths, about the fine line between treatment and punishment. But the system was slow to change. The walls of the asylum remembered every restraint, not in words, but in wear. A scratch in the stone near the chair, a water stain beneath the bathing slab, a scuffed patch on the door frame of the seclusion cell. Over time, some of these tools disappeared, others were renamed, but they all spoke to a deeper truth, that control in these institutions was inseparable from care. That to calm the troubled mind was to impose structure on chaos, that the hands which offered food in the morning might, by afternoon, be called to fasten straps. Imagine the clink of a buckle, the creak of leather pulled snug, the slow exhale of a patient held in place not out of malice, but because no other option remained. These were the tools of the institution, heavy, worn, always close at hand. Before the first stone was laid, before the first key was cut, before the first patient crossed its threshold, a Victorian asylum was already shaped by belief. Belief in design, belief in order, belief that the very walls could heal. In the 19th century, the architecture of asylums was not merely functional, it was philosophical. Buildings were not built merely to contain, but to correct. The structure itself was therapy. The corridors were long for a reason, the windows tall for a reason, the ceilings high, the wards symmetrical, the gardens walled but accessible, all of it arranged to reflect a sense of calm, containment, and quiet. It was known as the Kirkbride Plan. Developed by physician Thomas Story Kirkbride, this layout became the model for dozens of asylums across the English-speaking world. Though American in origin, its principles deeply influenced asylum design in Britain and its colonies. The Kirkbride Plan proposed a central administrative structure flanked by long, staggered wings. Each wing housed a different category of patient, those deemed calm and cooperative placed near the centre. The more agitated or dangerous moved outward, into the farther wings. The The result was a structure that, viewed from above, resembled a bird in flight. But the layout served more than symbolism. It allowed for separation without isolation. It enabled airflow, cooling breezes through windows aligned for cross-ventilation. Each ward could be flooded with natural light during the day. Darkness, it was thought, bred disorder. Light, by contrast, restored. Airflow was a central concern. In a time before electric fans or air conditioning, the management of air was both practical and medical. Fresh air was believed to soothe the nervous system, to carry away miasmas, the unseen vapors thought to cause disease. Windows were placed high to avoid drafts but allow light. Vents were incorporated into ceilings. Some asylums even featured internal air shafts, drawing warm air upward and releasing it through rooftop chimneys. Patients were frequently escorted outdoors, weather permitting. Walking paths were laid in gentle loops, bordered by flower beds or low hedges. These gardens were enclosed but never called yards. They were spaces of therapeutic intent, designed to simulate freedom within safe boundaries. But perhaps the most iconic and controversial element of Victorian institutional architecture was the panopticon. Originally conceived by philosopher Jeremy Bentham as a design for prisons, the panopticon was a circular structure built around a central observation tower. From that tower, a single watcher could, in theory, observe every individual within the structure without being seen in return. Though few asylums followed the panopticon blueprint exactly, its spirit lived in the layout of certain wards. Long halls with centrally positioned nursing stations, high windows angled inward, observation doors with small, silent peepholes. The message was clear, even when unspoken: you are always seen. For staff, the architecture shaped movement. Certain corridors were used only by attendants. Hidden staircases allowed nurses to move between levels without passing through patient wards. Some buildings had underground tunnels, cool, brick-lined, used to transfer supplies, laundry, and even patients without drawing notice. There were dedicated spaces for every need. Kitchens and laundries were set apart to contain smells. Chapels stood at the centre, their spires rising above even the administrative wings. Workshops, sewing rooms, libraries, each built with care, intended to foster routine. Colour played a role too. Walls were often painted in muted shades, soft greens, pale blues, creams and greys. These tones were thought to quiet the senses, to reduce agitation. Patterns were avoided. Simplicity reigned. Floors were wood or stone, sometimes covered in oilcloth. Rugs, if present, were nailed down to prevent slipping. Furniture was sturdy, not ornamental. Tables with rounded corners. Chairs too heavy to lift easily. Everything arranged to reduce risk. Even the acoustics were considered. High ceilings diffused sound. Thick doors muffled screams. Many asylums featured double doors between wards, an airlock of sorts to minimize the spread of noise. Quiet was not just appreciated, it was engineered. Yet despite all these intentions, the buildings could never quite escape their own gravity. Their size, their weight, their smell. For many patients, the very symmetry that soothed others became disorienting. The sameness of each corridor blurred memory. The unchanging views from barred windows slowly dulled the sense of time. Still, the architecture endured. Some of these structures still stand today, converted into flats, offices, or museums. Their facades remain imposing, their windows still catching the same grey light. And inside, in quiet corners, one can still sense the echo of their original purpose. Imagine now walking down one of those long hallways, the click of your shoes on stone, the filtered light from above, the distant creak of a door closing somewhere far away. The air moves softly around you. The silence is intentional. You are moving through a building that once believed it could heal with bricks and symmetry. And perhaps, in some ways, it did. The daytime hours in a Victorian asylum were ruled by rhythm, cleaning, feeding, inspecting, recording. But when night descended and the lamps were turned low, another kind of order took hold. Quieter, slower, and in many ways, heavier. This was the world of the night keeper. The night keeper, or night attendant as they were sometimes called, did not rest. From the hour the last meal was cleared to the first chime of the morning key exchange, their role was one of quiet vigilance. While others slept, they remained moving through shadowed corridors, unlocking and relocking doors, listening to the dark. Their shift began just before dusk. After receiving the day's final report, they were handed the night keys, fewer than the day ring, but no less weighty. These keys opened ward doors, medicine closets, and observation windows. They were worn at the waist, each movement accompanied by a soft chime of brass. The keeper made their first rounds early. Each ward was walked slowly, lantern in hand. The light cast a gentle arc across the wooden floors, glinting on bed frames and catching the pale fabric of sleeping gowns. The patients, if not yet fully asleep, often feigned it. The sound of boots in the corridor was enough to prompt stillness. Observation was done by proximity, no electric monitors, no intercoms, only the trained eye of someone who had learned to read shadows and silences. The keeper noted small things, blankets pushed off, murmured words, patients who sat up staring into the dark. These details were recorded not in formal ledgers, but in small personal books, kept in coat pockets and filled with neat, looping handwriting. Every hour, the keeper passed through the entire building. Some stops were perfunctory, others more deliberate. In wards where patients were known to wander, locks were double-checked. In rooms where someone had refused food, breath and pulse were gently watched from a distance. The goal was not to disturb, only to witness. Sleep, even for patients, was not guaranteed. There were cries in the night, soft at first, then rising. Sometimes a single voice, other times a cascade. The cries were often incoherent, sometimes prayers, sometimes laughter, sometimes screams muffled in a pillow. The keeper would step in, rarely speaking, perhaps placing a hand on a shoulder, perhaps only watching until quiet returned. There were protocols, but much depended on judgment. When to intervene, when to leave well enough alone, when to call for assistance, the balance was delicate. On occasion, the night was broken by more serious disruptions. A patient discovered out of bed, disoriented and confused. A fall, a fight, a fit. The keeper would respond, signal for help if needed, and file a report in the early morning. The tone of such reports was always calm, always precise. Patient became distressed at 2:12 a.m., it might read. Settled with warm cloth and silent company. In reality, the emotional burden could be immense. The silence of the wards was not peaceful. It was loaded. It contained sorrow, memory, confusion. And the keeper, walking alone with only a lantern and the sound of their own breath, absorbed much of it without release. In some asylums, a second night attendant was assigned. In others, the keeper was truly alone, save for a distant porter or sleeping nurse in the staff quarters. Meals were sparse. A cup of tea kept warm on a stove. A heel of bread wrapped in cloth, often eaten standing up between rounds, or not at all. There was no sleep, not even a doze. To be caught resting was grounds for dismissal, and yet many dozed where they could. A quiet corner, a soft chair near the furnace, a moment of peace before the next round. By early morning the building stirred again. Keys changed hands, the wards brightened. The keeper wrote their final notes, hung up their lantern, and left through the same door they entered, often without a word. And so the night passed. The patients remembered little of it, if anything at all. But the keeper remembered everything. The footsteps, the murmurs, the breathing, the sounds that were not quite cries, the rustle of sheets, the feeling that the entire building held its breath until morning. Imagine now walking softly through a corridor that seems longer than it did by day. The light from your lantern pools at your feet. Behind each door, someone sleeps or doesn't. And ahead of you, the dark stretches endlessly. This is the keeper's burden, to watch, to witness, and to wait for dawn. In the ledgers of the Victorian Asylum, one might come across a diagnosis that today seems more poetic than medical. Hysteria, religious mania, overexcitement of the spirit, uncontrollable prayer, sordenbedu. Each phrase written in elegant, unhurried script, its meaning shaped more by culture than by science. To the physicians of the 19th century, these were not metaphors. They were considered precise medical terms, though what they described was often anything but clear. Hysteria, especially, occupied a strange place in Victorian psychiatry. Derived from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb, it was thought by some to be a condition of women. A wandering womb, an imbalance of feminine nerves, a diagnosis more of behavior than biology, and it encompassed a great many things. A woman who wept too much might be called hysterical, one who laughed inappropriately, one who shouted, one who did not speak at all, one who refused to marry, one who expressed sexual desires, one who rejected them entirely. All of these, at different times, could fall under the wide umbrella of hysteria. For physicians, the label offered both explanation and excuse. It said, "Here is a case without physical injury, without fever, without cause. We can measure, but still something is wrong." And so the term persisted despite its vagueness. Treatments for hysteria were equally varied. Some patients were prescribed rest, total rest, no reading, no sewing, no conversation. A month in bed, curtains drawn, meals taken in silence. Others were given more active interventions, cold baths, galvanic stimulation, massage. In some institutions, a spinning chair was used, a device in which the patient was strapped into a seat and rotated rapidly, the centrifugal motion thought to correct the imbalance of inner forces. Not all patients labelled as hysterical were women, though most were. Men, when so diagnosed, were often described as melancholic, hysteric, or assigned overlapping terms like neurasthenic, a supposed weakness of the nerves, often attributed to intellectual overexertion. Religious mania was a different kind of mystery. It usually appeared in the wake of a spiritual awakening or during moments of intense personal loss. A patient might begin preaching aloud, quoting scripture, singing hymns long into the night. Others knelt in their rooms for hours, murmuring prayers, refusing to eat, except when fed what they called the body of Christ. Some believed they were prophets, some claimed they were saints, a few believed they were God. This form of mania was not always disruptive. Some patients were gentle, even reverent in their delusions. But for staff, the behavior was unnerving, especially when the words spoken were calm, the voice soft, and the eyes unblinking. In these cases, diagnosis became entangled with theology. Was the patient deluded or devout? And who was qualified to decide? The treatment of religious mania often began with separation, a quiet room, less stimulation, fewer visitors. Scripture was removed. Clergy, if present, were instructed not to engage in theological conversation. The goal was not to deny faith but to return it to proportion. Over time, patients might be allowed to attend chapel again, sit quietly at the back, listen to the sermon without speaking aloud. But some never reached that stage. They continued to preach to no one, or sang hymns during meals, or attempted to convert other patients, whispering salvation during shared walks. One case, preserved in the notes of a Yorkshire asylum, described a woman who recited the Book of Revelation from memory every morning in perfect sequence. Another spoke only in biblical riddles, her tone gentle, her eyes distant. For the staff, these diagnoses often blurred. Was the patient hysterical, manic, or devout? Could a spiritual fervor become an illness? Could an illness take the shape of faith? Physicians debated. Attendants observed. Nurses, quietly, made their own judgments. Some offered comfort, lighting a candle near a bedside, allowing a patient to hold a small cross during meals. Others insisted on strict neutrality, no symbols, no scripture, only silence. Over time, both diagnoses would fall out of medical fashion. Hysteria would become a relic of gendered medicine. Religious mania would be absorbed into broader terms: bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis. But in the Victorian asylum, they were real, lived, named, treated. They were written in the ledgers, spoken in staff meetings, whispered in the corridors. They shaped lives, they shaped treatment, and they left echoes. Imagine now a patient sitting at the edge of her bed, hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. A nurse walks by without pausing. A doctor passes with a glance. The corridor stretches on. Somewhere, a diagnosis is being written, and somewhere else, a prayer continues, unanswered. Long before the white-coated physicians arrived with glass bottles and stethoscopes, the treatment of mental affliction often began with plants. Even in the most structured and clinical of Victorian asylums, the role of herbs, roots, and tonics lingered in the medicine cupboards and staff recipes. Though official medicine increasingly leaned toward chemistry, there remained an undercurrent of older, earthbound remedies passed between nurses, noted in margins, boiled quietly in back kitchens. There was, for example, the use of valerian root, a small, knobby plant with thread-like roots and a faintly bitter scent. It was steeped into teas meant to calm the nerves. The taste was earthy, slightly metallic. Patients were given it in the evening, often in warm ceramic cups, accompanied by soft words and a folded blanket. It did not cure, but it soothed. Chamomile was common too, used not only in tea but also in poultices and baths. Its fragrance, mild and apple-like, filled the wardrooms on certain evenings when staff tried to create a sense of peace. Then came the harsher tonics. Tincture of laudanum, a compound made from opium and alcohol, was both medicine and danger. It was given in drops, counted carefully onto a spoon or into a small glass vial, used for sleeplessness, for agitation, for pain. But too much too easily led to silence. Some patients became dependent. Others were quietly weaned off it, replaced with gentler mixtures. The bottles were stored under lock, their labels carefully marked. Bromide salts were another staple. Mixed into water or milk, they dulled the senses, slowed the speech, and quelled restlessness. Patients who paced might stop. Those who shouted might whisper. It was seen as progress, though the light in their eyes sometimes dimmed alongside their symptoms. Iron tonics were given to the melancholic. Believed to strengthen the blood and lift the mood, they were thick, metallic, often taken reluctantly. The flavor was strong and clung to the tongue. Some patients spat it out. Others drank without complaint, their gaze unmoved. Magnesia, rhubarb, senna, these were administered to treat what was then called internal agitation. The Victorian belief in the gut-mind connection was strong. Constipation, bloating, and indigestion were thought to cloud the mind. Regular bowel movements were considered essential to mental clarity. And so, stews and teas were laced with subtle laxatives, not cruelly, but methodically, a gentle purge, a softening of the body to release the mind. Elderflower, lemon balm, lavender, these more delicate herbs found their way into salves and infusions. A nurse might tuck a sprig of dried lavender beneath a patient's pillow, or dab a small cloth with rosewater to cool a fevered brow. These gestures were unofficial, unwritten, but often remembered. In some institutions, gardens were maintained specifically for these purposes. Small plots of calendula, mint, thyme, and foxglove grew behind the laundry or beside the outer walls. Staff, particularly older nurses, knew what to pick and when. Which leaf eased headaches, which flower could be safely dried and steeped. But not all remedies were gentle. Some tonics included mercury compounds, calomel most commonly. Intended to purge the system, it was powerful, bitter, and dangerous in excess. Its use waned over the century, but not soon enough for some. Turpentine, too, found its way into medicinal recipes. Mixed into sugar or oil, it was used to treat intestinal parasites or persistent cough. The taste was sharp, the side effects unpleasant. But for certain conditions, there were few alternatives. Staff learned to balance dosage with demeanor. A patient who resisted might be coaxed with honey. A bitter draught might be followed with warm broth or a biscuit. Nurses became adept at watching for side effects, tremors, sweating, pallor, and adjusting accordingly. There was a hierarchy of trust. Doctors prescribed, nurses administered. But it was often the nurse who decided what truly went down the throat and how. And then there were the unrecorded remedies. A slice of ginger root tucked into warm cloth for cramping, a spoonful of cider vinegar in tea to lift the spirits, a warm potato placed on the chest of a weeping patient for reasons no one could quite explain but that often brought comfort. Not every cure was chemical. Sometimes, healing arrived in the form of routine, a warm drink served with care, a predictable meal, a scent remembered from childhood. These small acts, repeated daily, created a rhythm that grounded the disoriented, softened the frightened, and restored, if only slightly, a sense of self. Imagine now the quiet hiss of a kettle on a coal stove, the rustle of dried herbs poured into a cloth sachet, the steady hand of a nurse stirring a tonic, her eyes not on the mixture, but on the patient across the room. In the Victorian asylum, medicine was often bitter, but it was also warm, also gentle, also laced with hope. And though the tonics may have been harsh, the hands that offered them were not always so. Their footsteps were soft, but their presence was constant. Long before the doctor arrived with his clipboard, before the stewards counted heads or the keepers fetched their keys, the nurses were already there, pinning aprons, folding blankets, checking linens, preparing the wards for another day. They were the quiet machinery of the asylum, and though they rarely held titles, their hands shaped the rhythm of the institution. The women who served as nurses in Victorian asylums were often unmarried, middle-aged, or widowed. Some entered nursing out of economic necessity, others out of religious calling, and still others because there were few other places for a woman to find stable work. Whatever their reason, they became part of a system both demanding and invisible. Each day began early, often by 5 in the morning. Uniforms were simple but exacting, high-necked dresses of navy or grey, white aprons, and caps pinned carefully over tightly coiled hair. Shoes were sturdy, stockings thick. Jewelry was forbidden, fragrance discouraged, modesty was expected. Their duties were many. First came the morning check, a silent walk through the ward, counting patients, noting any disturbances during the night. A quick visual assessment, who had slept, who had not, who seemed calmer, who seemed worse. Nothing was written yet, but everything was noticed. Next came the morning wash. Basins were filled, cloths distributed. Some patients bathed themselves, others required full assistance. A nurse might gently scrub a patient's scalp or carefully dry between fingers stiff with age or tension. The movements were practiced, patient, and always quiet. Talking was permitted, but not encouraged. By breakfast, nurses assisted with distribution, carrying trays, helping patients to tables, guiding spoons to mouths when hands trembled or refused to move. They watched who ate and who did not, recording such details in small books at the end of each shift. Between meals, the work continued. Beds were made and remade, floors swept, shelves dusted, medicine administered, notes copied, charts updated. When patients were agitated, nurses calmed them. When they were despondent, Nurses kept them company, not with long conversations, but with quiet presence. A chair pulled closer, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder. There were rules. No sitting down during rounds, no eating in view of patients, no emotional display. Nurses were expected to be calm, efficient, neutral. To show too much sympathy was considered unprofessional. To show too little, cold. The balance was difficult and rarely acknowledged. When doctors made their rounds, nurses accompanied them, providing updates in clipped, factual tones. Refused food since Tuesday. Slept 5 hours last night. Became distressed during washing. Their observations were often more accurate than the physician's impressions, but their voices carried less weight. And yet, it was the nurses who knew. They knew which patients preferred their tea warm and which would only drink it cool. Which ones could not bear loud sounds. Which ones rocked before bed. Which ones feared being touched. Which ones waited for letters that never came. In the afternoons, nurses supervised needlework, mending, and reading. They led walks in the garden. They sang hymns softly in chapel. They coaxed smiles, eased tensions, cleaned messes, mediated disputes, and held the ward together with patience and repetition. Discipline was part of the job. A nurse might be required to report a patient's aggression or to assist in applying a restraint. She might be asked to sit through an episode of mania or to support a doctor during a forced feeding. These tasks were not discussed afterward. They were simply done, then folded into the day like any other duty. Some nurses took great pride in their wards, kept them spotless, decorated the walls with small pictures cut from calendars, pressed flowers between pages of old books and placed them by windowsills. These touches were unofficial but meaningful. Others grew distant, weary, their steps slower, their words curt. The toll of years measured not in grey hairs but in the way they sat when no one was looking, shoulders slumped, hands still folded, eyes no longer watching. There were few thanks, no bonuses, no medals, sometimes a Christmas pudding, sometimes a letter of commendation filed away in a drawer. But still, they came each day, laced their boots, pinned their caps, took the same path to the ward, opened the same door. And the patients, whether they could say so or not, noticed their absence when they were gone. Imagine now the hush of the ward, late afternoon light slanting through high windows. A nurse kneels to tie a patient's shoe, another refills a basin. A third hums, just barely audible, as she folds a blanket. They are not celebrated in the histories. Their names, if written at all, are buried in staffing logs. But they were there, always there. In the quieter corners of the Victorian Asylum, where the clang of keys faded and the murmur of wards softened, music sometimes found its way through the air. Not the loud, rousing kind that stirred soldiers to march, nor the lively dance tunes of public houses. This was different. This was music chosen for stillness, for order, for the belief firm among some doctors and many nurses that sound could be a medicine all its own. In the mid to late 19th century, certain asylums began experimenting with what was then called moral treatment. This was the belief that a calm environment, humane care, and structured activities could aid in restoring mental balance. Within this framework, music was considered a gentle but powerful tool, and the instrument most often chosen for the task was the harp. The harp, with its tall, graceful frame and rippling notes, was thought to embody serenity. Its sound was soft but penetrating, able to fill the high-ceilinged wards without the sharpness of a violin or the boom of a piano. Played slowly, it seemed to wash over the room like water over stone. Some asylums employed music teachers, often genteel women from nearby towns, who came in once or twice a week to play for the patients. Others relied on staff who happened to have musical training. In rare cases, a patient themselves played, supervised closely, the harp positioned in a corner where they could be seen but not interrupted. The choice of music was deliberate. Hymns, with their steady, predictable structures, were common. Simple airs from folk traditions, slow marches, gentle nocturnes. Anything too spirited or unpredictable was avoided. The goal was not excitement, but quiet attention. Sessions often took place in day rooms, where chairs were drawn into loose semicircles. The harpist sat in the open space, her fingers moving with slow certainty over the strings. The room, usually restless with small sounds, shuffling feet, muttering voices, the occasional cough would grow still. Not silent, exactly, but softened. Some patients listened with eyes closed. Others stared at the strings, following the motion of the player's hands. A few rocked gently in time with the rhythm. And there were those who seemed unaffected, looking away, speaking to themselves, or walking the perimeter of the room without pause. Yet the music continued, weaving into the air, unbothered. In some institutions, the harp was joined by other instruments. A small reed organ, a flute, even a cello. But the harp remained central, its sound less imposing than the organ, more sustained than the flute, more ethereal than the cello. The belief in music's power was not unfounded. Even the most skeptical attendants noted changes after a session: calmer meals, quieter evenings, fewer disturbances at night. Whether it was the sound itself or the rare sense of shared experience, no one could say. There were special occasions too. On holidays, the harp might be moved to the main hall, joined by singers from the staff or the local parish choir, carols at Christmas time, harvest hymns in autumn. These performances drew more patients than usual, some even dressing in their best for the occasion. Between sessions, the harp was covered with a heavy cloth to protect it from dust. It stood like a sentinel in a corner of the day room, silent but expectant. Its mere presence seemed to promise that music would return. For staff, these moments were as much a reprieve as they were therapy for the patients. To sit for 30 minutes without the clatter of duties, to hear something purely beautiful, to be reminded, if only briefly, of a world beyond the walls. There is a description in the diary of a nurse from an 1872nd asylum. Mrs. P played the harp for us today in the South Hall. Several ladies sang softly. One man wept without making a sound. I cannot say why, only that the music seemed to make the air lighter to breathe. Today, we might call it art therapy, or simply music therapy. Then, it was just part of the moral treatment, one more tool in the attempt to reach the unreachable. Imagine now sitting in that hall. The tall windows spill muted afternoon light onto the floor. A woman in a plain dress adjusts the angle of her harp. Her hands rise and fall, strings vibrating in gentle waves. The sound travels outward, through the warm air, through you, into the stillness beyond. It is not a cure, but it is a balm. And sometimes, in the long, quiet hours of asylum life, that was enough. Long before a patient set foot inside a Victorian asylum, before the clang of the gate or the turning of the ward key, there was paper. Paper, ink, and signatures. The process of involuntary commitment was at once deeply bureaucratic and deeply personal. On the surface, it was a matter of legal procedure. In reality, it was often the product of worry, fear, shame, or desperation. Families were the first link in the chain. A husband troubled by his wife's melancholy spells. A son disturbed by his father's strange fits. A brother embarrassed by a sister's wandering fancies. The words might sound mild, even polite, but beneath them lay urgency, sometimes genuine concern, sometimes the weight of social propriety. In Victorian England, to admit someone to an asylum without their consent required the completion of formal certificates. These were typically issued by two separate physicians, each having examined the individual and declared them of unsound mind. The examinations themselves could be brief: 15 minutes in a parlour, a few questions about the day's date, the name of the monarch, the location of the home. The law required that the doctors be independent of one another, but in smaller towns they might well be old acquaintances. Their diagnoses could reflect not just the patient's behavior, but the opinions of those who summoned them. Once the certificates were in hand, an application was made to a magistrate or local authority. This step was often more formality than challenge. The magistrate relied on the doctor's written statements. Rarely was there direct questioning of the patient. And so, with these documents complete, the decision was sealed. On the day of admission, the patient might be told they were going to visit relatives or to take the air in the country. They might be accompanied in a cab by family members or brought under escort by a parish officer. In some cases, the truth was known from the start and resisted fiercely. In others, it came only at the sight of the asylum's gates. At the entrance, more paperwork awaited. The asylum clerk recorded the patient's name, age, place of birth, marital status, occupation, religion, and supposed cause of illness. The last category was perhaps the most telling. Causes ranged from the medical epilepsy, brain fever, childbirth, to the moral domestic trouble, religious excitement, love affairs, disappointment. The paperwork was thorough, but the language vague. A life condensed into a few lines of ink. Families were required to provide details about the patient's habits, temperament, and any history of mental disturbance. They might list hereditary tendency if other relatives had suffered similar conditions. They might note the onset date of the malady, often tracing it to a single incident, a bereavement, a financial loss, a quarrel. For the patient, there was little opportunity to contest any of this. The forms spoke for them, and the forms were final. Once admitted, families might visit. In the early days, visits were often discouraged in the belief that they could unsettle patients. Over time, some asylums relaxed this rule, allowing visits once a month, then once a fortnight. But distance, cost, and the stigma attached to the asylum meant that many patients saw their relatives rarely, if ever. Letters could be written, though these were often censored by staff. A patient might request writing materials. The nurse might supply them. The resulting letter might never leave the building. Sometimes it was decided that it would not be in the patient's interest for their words to reach the outside. For the family, the paperwork was a closing of the matter. They had done their duty. The patient was in care. Their own lives could resume. In some cases, there was relief. In others, guilt. But over time, both feelings tended to fade into the quiet absence that followed. Inside the asylum, the paperwork was filed neatly in drawers or bound into large ledgers. Names, dates, causes, doctors' statements, magistrates' approvals, all stored in careful order. Years later, they would still be there, faintly yellowed, the ink slightly faded, and in the margins, occasionally, a note. Diet 12 April 1878. Discharged, improved, transferred to county asylum. The patient's story reduced to an entry. Imagine now a clerk dipping his pen into ink, scratching across the page in measured strokes, a stack of forms to his left, a small pile of completed certificates to his right. Outside the office, a carriage waits in the gravel drive. Inside it, someone sits in uneasy silence, unaware of the paperwork that has just shaped their fate. The pen pauses. The clerk blows gently to dry the ink. The decision is already made. Every large building develops its own quiet mysteries, and the Victorian asylum was no exception. Among the long corridors and the regimented wards, there were always places that fell outside the rhythm of daily life. Rooms without a purpose. Rooms no one entered unless they had to. And then there was the clock. It sat in one of these forgotten rooms, high on the wall above a cold, disused mantel. Tall, round-faced, set in a wooden frame darkened by years of dust and coal smoke. It was a respectable clock once, perhaps imported from a city workshop, its hands a deep wrought iron, its face marked in bold Roman numerals. But it never rang. The minute hand still crept forward, the pendulum still swayed gently behind its glass door. yet its chime remained stubbornly silent. No one could remember when it had last struck the hour. The maintenance man claimed it was disconnected decades ago. The night-keeper thought it had been silenced after waking too many patients in the small hours. A nurse, older than most, swore it had always been silent. The room that held it had no official name. In the ward records, it was referred to simply as storage, though there was little stored there. A few broken chairs, a small writing desk without drawers, a stack of rolled-up canvas screens, a box of curtain rings without their curtains. The dust was thick along the skirting boards, disturbed only by the occasional sweep of a broom when someone remembered. It was the sort of room a new attendant might stumble upon while searching for something else. They would open the door, peer into the dimness, smell the dry scent of old wood and paper. Their eyes would fall on the clock, and, for a moment, they would wait, listening for a chime that never came. The silence of the clock seemed deliberate, as though the building had decided that this one measure of time should remain unspoken. In an asylum, time was everything. Bells marked the hours. Meals, medicine, cleaning, recreation, each had its appointed moment. But this clock refused to join the chorus. It marked the minutes without reminding anyone of their passing. Some of the staff liked it for that. They said it felt restful, a corner of the building that did not push or prod or summon. In a place where even the air seemed scheduled, the clock's muteness was a kind of rebellion. Others found it unsettling. The patients rarely came into the room, but when they did, they often stared at the clock longer than seemed natural. One man, quiet most days, once said in a low voice, "It's waiting." Asked what for, he only shook his head. The truth was simpler. The striking mechanism had broken, and repairs were never approved. Funds were tight, and a silent clock did no harm, so it stayed silent. But over the years it gathered a certain presence. The nurses used it as a meeting point for whispered conversations. The night-keeper sometimes sat in there during the last round before dawn, enjoying the company of a timepiece that demanded nothing from him. Even so, dust claimed the mantle, and the air in the room was always cooler, heavier. The windows faced north, admitting a dim, cold light even in summer. On rainy days, the sound of water tapping the panes was the only noise to keep the clock company. There were other forgotten rooms in the asylum. An attic space where old uniforms were stored, still faintly smelling of soap and starch. A locked cupboard in the basement with ledgers so old their leather spines had curled. A tiled chamber that had once been used for hydrotherapy, now empty except for the echo of dripping water. But the room with the clock held a peculiar charm. You could stand there and imagine for a moment that the rest of the building did not exist, that the endless schedules, the ringing bells, the shuffling lines of patients were part of another world entirely. In that room, time moved quietly, and though the clock never rang, it still kept watch. Imagine now standing before it, the pendulum swinging in a slow, steady arc, the only sound the faint tick, tick, tick of its movement. A rhythm without interruption, a measure without command. You glance at the hands. They tell you it is nearly the hour. You wait, and, as always, the chime never comes. Beyond the wards, past the last gravel path and through a set of low gates, the grounds of many Victorian asylums opened into something unexpected. Fields. Wide, rolling stretches of cultivated land, rows of vegetables, orchards, herb gardens, and beyond them perhaps the low rooflines of barns and sheds. This was the asylum farm. In the 19th century, large institutions often aimed for self-sufficiency, not just as a matter of economy, but as a matter of treatment. Doctors and governors alike believed that productive outdoor work could soothe restless minds, provide purpose, and anchor patients in a rhythm outside the walls. The term therapeutic labor had not yet been coined, but its principles were here, in soil and seed. Patients selected for gardening work were those deemed physically able and, in the language of the time, trustworthy. They were escorted out in small groups, some accompanied by attendants, others working more freely under the watch of a foreman. Spring was the busiest season. Beds were dug, manure spread, seeds sown in straight, careful lines. The soil was dark and cool to the touch, the scent of it clinging to hands and sleeves. Bent over the rows, the patients moved slowly, some with quiet concentration, others talking softly to themselves. The crops varied: potatoes, carrots, cabbages, turnips, beans, peas. In warmer months, tomatoes and cucumbers grew in glasshouse frames. Herbs were cultivated for the kitchens and the medicine room: mint, parsley, sage, chamomile. Some patients took special pride in the orchard, pruning branches, harvesting apples, pears, and plums in season. The fruit was stored in cool cellars, dried, or stewed for winter meals. There was work for every season. Summer brought weeding and watering, the long days stretching into golden evenings when the light lingered and the air was filled with the hum of bees. Autumn meant harvest root vegetables pulled from the earth, their skins dusted with soil, stored in burlap sacks or wooden bins. Winter brought maintenance, sharpening tools, mending fences, pruning trees to bear shapes against the grey sky. The gardens were more than a food source. They were a place of change in a world that often felt changeless. The wards remained the same, the schedules unyielding but outside. Seasons shifted. The bare earth of February became the green shoots of April, the full bloom of June, the gold and red of October. For some patients, this was the closest they came to marking the passage of time in a natural way. The work itself had a rhythm: the scrape of a hoe, the thud of a spade biting into earth, the rustle of leaves gathered into baskets, the splash of water from a wooden pail. These sounds blended into a background hum, steady and unhurried. Some patients worked in silence, others exchanged short phrases, often about the task at hand. A crooked row corrected, a missed weed spotted, the occasional chuckle when a stubborn root finally gave way. Attendants, too, seemed different outdoors. Their voices softened, they were less formal, less hurried. They might share a piece of fruit or comment on the weather without glancing at the clock. There were failures, of course, crops spoiled by blight, frost-killing seedlings, rabbits eating through tender leaves. But even these were met with a certain acceptance. The earth was unpredictable. One learned to begin again. In some asylums, produce from the gardens was sold in local markets. This brought in modest income and, for the institution, a sense of quiet pride. Our own potatoes, a matron might say at dinner, our own carrots in the soup today. There were also ornamental gardens, flower beds, arranged in neat borders, lawns trimmed with geometric precision, gravel walks swept daily. These were for visitors, for staff leisure, and for certain patients who found calm in tending blooms rather than crops. Roses, delphiniums, hollyhocks, marigolds, bright colours against the muted walls of the asylum. It was not all ideal, of course. Work could be hard, the sun unforgiving, the rain soaking. For some, the labour was less therapeutic than exhausting, but for many, the garden offered a reprieve from the confines of stone and brick. Imagine now a late summer afternoon. The sun hangs low but warm. The scent of turned earth mingles with the sweetness of ripening fruit. Somewhere nearby, a spade hits stone. In the distance, the bell for supper rings faintly, its sound softened by the air. The workers straighten slowly, leaning on their tools. Their boots are muddy, their hands roughened, but their eyes lift toward the sky, and for a moment the walls of the asylum feel far away. In the gardens, time is measured not by the clock but by the season, and sometimes that was the gentlest measure of all. Deep within the grounds of many Victorian asylums, tucked away behind high hedges or set apart from the main buildings, there was often a chapel. Sometimes it was a proud, spired structure visible from the road, its stained glass windows catching the morning light. Other times, it was more modest, a small, gabled hall hidden between service buildings, known mainly to those who worked there or walked the grounds daily. The chapel served a dual purpose. For administrators, it was a statement of moral intent. The institution did not only aim to restore the mind, but also to guide or at least sustain the soul. For staff and patients alike, it was a space that existed slightly outside the regimented life of the wards. In the early years of Victorian psychiatry, spiritual care was seen as integral to recovery. It was believed that worship could instill discipline, provide comfort, and remind patients of their place in a wider moral order. Services were held on Sundays, sometimes midweek, and always on major Christian holidays. Attendance was encouraged, sometimes gently, sometimes insistently. Patients were led in small groups to the chapel, seated in rows divided by gender, their attendants positioned discreetly nearby. The chapels themselves were quiet, dignified spaces, polished wooden pews, simple altars adorned with flowers from the asylum gardens, walls painted in pale, calming colours, cream, soft green, or muted blue. In wealthier institutions, stained glass windows depicted scenes of healing, pastoral care, or biblical stories of restoration. In humbler chapels, the glass was plain, the light uncoloured but still softened as it fell across the room. The service was predictable, an opening hymn, a reading from Scripture, a short sermon measured in tone, simple in content, often drawing on themes of patience, hope, and redemption. Another hymn, then a closing prayer. The hymns were chosen for their familiarity and gentle pace. Abide with me, nearer, my God, to thee. The Lord is my shepherd. For some patients, the words held deep meaning. For others, the sound of the organ and the rise and fall of voices were simply part of the week's rhythm. The asylum chaplain was a distinctive figure, part clergyman, part counsellor, part observer. He visited the wards, spoke with patients individually, sometimes recorded his impressions in the medical notes. He might pray at a bedside, read aloud to a patient too agitated to attend service, or simply sit quietly with someone in a moment of distress. Faith in the asylum was not always Christian, though the dominant presence was Anglican in England, Presbyterian in Scotland, and Catholic in Ireland. In cities with diverse populations, chaplains of other denominations or even other faiths were occasionally called upon to visit. Jewish patients might receive a rabbi, Catholic patients a priest. These visits were rarer but valued, often marking important holy days. For some, the chapel was a true sanctuary, a place where the weight of confinement lifted slightly, where voices could rise in something other than distress. For others, it was a reminder of moral judgments they did not share. Attendance could be resented, resisted, even feared, but most complied, walking quietly to the pews, standing when told, sitting when told, leaving when the final Amen was spoken. Outside of formal worship, the chapel was used for other moments: weddings of staff, christenings of infants born to nurses or attendants, funerals for those who died within the institution. These latter ceremonies were often small, attended by a handful of staff and perhaps one or two patients who had been close to the deceased. The coffins were simple, the graves in a nearby plot marked modestly or not at all. The presence of the chapel also influenced the physical rhythm of the place. On Sundays, there was a sense of slowed movement. Meals were quieter, work reduced. The gardens near the chapel filled with the sound of hymns drifting through open windows. For those who did not attend, the music was still part of the day, arriving faintly down the corridors. Imagine now stepping into that space on a late autumn morning. The air is cool, faintly scented with wax polish and the lingering sweetness of last week's flowers. The organ pipes stand like silent sentinels at the front. Light filters in through tall windows, falling in pale columns across the wooden pews. The silence here feels different, less watchful than the wards, more open, almost tender. The service has not yet begun, but the room already holds a kind of stillness. Somewhere outside, a bell will ring, and the doors will open to let in a slow-moving line of patients, each carrying their own story, their own hopes, their own silences. In the chapel, for a short time, they will sit together. If the chapel was the quiet soul of the Victorian asylum, then the corridors were its arteries, and they had to be kept spotless. Cleanliness was not only a matter of hygiene but of discipline. The Victorian belief in order as a moral force meant that a clean, well-kept ward was thought to encourage calm in patients and pride in staff. And so, each day began and ended with the rituals of chalk marks and floor scrubbing. The chalk came first. White sticks, kept in a tin box in the ward cupboard, used by attendants to mark small scuffs, stains, or areas to be deep cleaned later. The marks might be simple crosses on floorboards, dots along the skirting, or circles drawn near a stubborn patch that needed more than a quick sweep. It was an old habit, borrowed from military barracks and schoolrooms, but it worked. The chalk marks made the invisible visible, guiding the cleaner's eye. Then came the scrubbing. The floors in the wards were mostly wood narrow planks running the length of the corridor, polished over years by boots, buckets, and brushes. In some areas, stone or tile replaced wood, especially near kitchens, washrooms, and service entrances. Wherever the floor was, it had to be scrubbed. Not just swept, not just mopped, but scrubbed, brushed until the bristles squeaked against the grain, until the boards looked bare and new again. Buckets were filled at the nearest pump or tap, sometimes carried long distances down the hall. The water was often hot, the steam clouding the air in the early morning light. Into it went soap flakes brown, harsh on the hands, dissolving slowly. The scent of it clung to the walls, mingling with the faint tang of polish and the sharper smell of disinfectant. Scrubbing was hard work. The brushes had stiff bristles set in heavy wooden blocks, and they were pushed back and forth with both hands, the motion steady and relentless. Nurses and attendants often worked on their knees, aprons tied high to keep them from soaking. Every so often they would pause to wring out a cloth, straighten their backs, and glance down the long corridor to see how much remained. Once the scrubbing was finished, clean water was poured over the boards and swept away with long-handled squeegees. The floor was left to dry, naturally windows open just enough to let in a draught, but not enough to chill the room. By mid-morning the surface gleamed faintly in the light, smelling faintly of soap and wood. This work was not reserved for staff alone. Patients often helped, particularly those in better health or considered suitable for light duties. Some took pride in it, polishing a section of floor until it shone, as though erasing the marks of the day before. Others worked more slowly, pausing often, the brush held like an unfamiliar tool. A few resisted entirely and were given different tasks, dusting chairs, folding blankets, or carrying water. Floors were not the only surfaces scrubbed. Wooden chair legs, skirting boards, table edges, window sills, anything that could gather dust or fingerprints was cleaned. The polishing of brass doorknobs and handrails was a small but visible point of pride. A gleaming knob said something about the ward and about those who ran it. In truth, the scrubbing was as much about ritual as it was about dirt. It gave the day a shape. It provided movement, purpose, a visible before and after. In a place where change was often imperceptible, here was a task that transformed a space in a matter of minutes. There is an account from a former asylum attendant who recalled, "When the floors were scrubbed and the windows opened, you felt as though the building could breathe again. Without it, the air turned heavy. The walls seemed closer. Even the patients noticed." Imagine now the soft rasp of the brush on wet boards, the muted slap of water against wood, the faint dusting of chalk beneath your fingertips. The corridor stretches long ahead, its end hidden in the haze of steam and morning light. And somewhere in that gentle rhythm mark, scrub, rinse, repeat, the asylum itself exhales. There was a part of asylum work that few liked to speak of, but all knew well. It was the quiet vigilance of suicide watch. A duty never written about in the polite public reports, yet woven into the daily and nightly routine of life inside the walls. Patients at risk were rarely left alone. If their condition was judged dangerous through self-harm, severe despair, or spoken threats, they were placed in the observation rooms nearest the attendant stations. These rooms were sparsely furnished. A low bed, a coarse blanket, a basin. No mirrors. No cords. Windows set high and screened. Everything chosen to leave as little opportunity as possible for harm. Attendants were assigned to keep a constant, discreet watch. Not a direct stare that could agitate or humiliate, but a steady presence. Perhaps sitting in the doorway with mending in hand, or sweeping the same stretch of corridor repeatedly, always within earshot. At night, they walked the ward at regular intervals, peering in through observation panels, pausing to listen for the smallest sound. The duty required a particular kind of attention alertness without intrusion. Too much engagement could unsettle, too little could miss the signs. A sudden stillness where there had been restlessness, a strange quiet in someone usually noisy, the folding of a blanket over and over, the refusal to meet a gaze. Small things, often dismissed by others, were the watchkeeper's early warnings. Not all incidents could be prevented. Even in the most attentive wards, tragedy sometimes came silently, quickly. The staff bore it quietly, carrying the memory for years. Officially, such events were written in precise, detached language. Unofficially, they lingered in the mind as vivid moments. The sound of a door forced open, the rush of feet along a corridor, the sudden stillness afterward. It was in these night hours, during long rounds, that another sort of story crept into the asylum, the ghost tale. They were not told to frighten patients, never openly, but whispered between staff when the building felt too large, too empty, too quiet. An attendant might speak of footsteps heard on the upper landing long after everyone was in bed. A nurse might recall a shadow crossing the ward when no one stood there. A keeper might swear that on certain nights a door latch clicked open on its own. These tales were never written down, but they passed from one shift to the next, embroidered slightly with each telling. One popular story in many asylums was of the empty bed. A patient was said to have died suddenly one night. The next evening, an attendant entering the ward would find the bed neatly made but the blanket turned down, as if waiting. In the days following, some claimed to have seen the impression of a body in the sheets, faint and fleeting, disappearing the moment anyone came close. Another told of the disused hydrotherapy room abandoned after years without use, where the sound of dripping water persisted, though no pipes remained. At night, the sound grew louder, some said, and if you stood in the doorway long enough, you could hear a faint humming, like someone singing under their breath. Such stories did not always frighten. In a strange way, they offered comfort. They suggested that those who had suffered here were still part of the place, watching alongside the living. For attendants on long, solitary rounds, that thought could be less lonely than the alternative. Still, most kept such tales quiet. The work of the asylum required steadiness, and talk of ghosts could unnerve the younger staff, or, worse, be overheard by a patient and spark new fears. So the stories stayed among the keepers, traded in low tones in the porter's room or by the ward stove in the small hours before dawn. Whether one believed in them or not, the building itself seemed to invite such imaginings. The long, echoing corridors, the drafts that moved unseen, the sudden cold spots where the air felt different, heavier, the way gaslight sometimes flickered as if reacting to more than just the air. On suicide watch, alone in those hours, the mind wandered easily into such territory. A creak on the stairs, a whisper that turned out to be the wind, the sound of breathing that was only your own. Imagine now walking slowly down a dim ward at 2 in the morning, your lantern light stretching only a few steps ahead. Each door you pass is closed. Each window shows only darkness beyond. You pause at a small room and glance through the panel. Inside, a patient sleeps peacefully, or seems to. You linger just long enough to be sure. Then you move on, your steps soft, the silence deep. And somewhere behind you, perhaps, you think you hear another step. But you do not turn around. At the far end of the women's wing, beyond the last ward door, and down a short side corridor, often polished more carefully than the rest, stood a door painted a shade darker than the others. Its brass plaque read simply, "Matron." Behind that door was a world both quieter and sharper than the wards, an office of starch, order, and tea. The matron was not a doctor. She did not prescribe medicine or make diagnoses, yet in many ways she ran the asylum, or, at least, the parts that mattered most to the people who lived and worked inside it. She was the central authority on discipline, on standards of behavior, on proper conduct in the dining hall and the linen room. She oversaw the female staff, reviewed their appearance and punctuality, corrected their posture, and settled their disputes. She inspected the wards, marked absences, counted pillows. Her word carried weight. Her presence carried stillness. She was usually a woman of middle years, unmarried, often with decades of service behind her. She moved through the building with the efficiency of someone who knew its sounds, the clink of an empty pail, the creak of a carelessly opened window, the hush of a nurse's voice raised too sharply. Nothing escaped her notice. Her office was not grand, but it was impeccably kept. A desk placed perfectly square to the window, a tea tray on a small side table, set with a cloth doily and a tin of loose leaves. Shelves held logbooks, ward rosters, and a few volumes of medical reference more for appearance than use. The scent in the room was always the same: beeswax, paper, and bergamot. At one corner of the desk sat a small vase, refreshed weekly with a single flower, sometimes a sprig of lavender, sometimes a rose clipped from the asylum's garden. It was a quiet rebellion against the sterility of her duties. Staff entered the matron's office for many reasons. A new nurse might be summoned for a brief but thorough interview, seated with knees pressed together, hands folded in her lap, answering questions about her training and her references. An attendant might be asked to explain a late arrival or a broken rule. There was rarely shouting. The matron preferred quiet reprimands, given in cool, even tones that left no room for protest. Occasionally, a patient would be brought in never alone, always accompanied after some small breach of conduct. The matron would speak to them gently but firmly. The patient might cry, or sit mute, or stare at the flower on the desk. The encounter was brief, and the patient returned to the ward, perhaps with a new routine, a closer watch, or simply the memory of that quiet room. The matron kept order, but she also kept kindness, though it was never worn openly. She noticed when a nurse was pale and sat her down with tea. She arranged for shoes to be resoled when they wore too thin. She allowed a patient to tend the garden longer than scheduled because she saw the calm it brought. She permitted exceptions, quietly, where they did good. She remembered birthdays, not with gifts, but with a nod, a shift in the tone of her voice, a slice of fruitcake saved from the staff tea. At night, when the wards were dark, she remained a little longer in her office, writing reports, reviewing notes, drinking her final cup of tea in silence. The gaslight flickered against the window pane, and the quiet tick of her wall clock kept her company. Staff respected her, some feared her, a few resented her standards, but no one ignored her. She was the still point in a building of movement. The one person who, when she entered a room, caused people to straighten their posture and lower their voices without realizing they'd done it. Imagine now her hand dipping a pen into ink, writing in smooth, practiced strokes. She pauses only to sip from a porcelain cup, steam curling in the lamplight. Outside her door, footsteps pass without stopping. Inside, everything is in its place. The wards stretch out beyond her office, but here is control, order, and a quiet kind of care. This is the matron's office, where discipline is served with tea. In the long wards of the Victorian Asylum, night was never truly silent. Even when the gas lamps were dimmed and the day's final duties completed, the air still carried small sounds soft enough to ignore by day, but magnified in the stillness of the dark. There was, for instance, the sound of the beds. The bedsteads were metal in many wards, iron frames painted over and repainted through the years. They stood in neat rows, a thin aisle between each. In the day they were silent, but at night the smallest movement could set them rattling, a patient turning in sleep, a sudden jolt awake, a restless leg kicking at the footboard. The vibrations carried from one frame to the next, a chain of faint clinks and murmurs of metal against metal. Some patients rocked themselves to sleep, moving rhythmically so that the bed shivered in place. Others gripped the rails and shifted constantly, never finding rest. The attendants on night rounds came to know each bed's particular sound, who moved often, who slept still, whose restlessness meant trouble was brewing. There were also the whispered names, not always the patient's own. Sometimes they were names from another time, a brother, long dead, a mother, a child. Sometimes the name was repeated softly, endlessly, like a prayer. At other times it was spoken urgently, as though calling across a great distance. The whispers could be tender, or pleading, or fearful, and sometimes they were not to anyone at all, but to something unseen in the patient's mind. Attendants learned not to interrupt unless the whispers rose to cries. The night was easier if these murmured conversations were left to fade naturally. To stop them abruptly could bring confusion, agitation, or sudden tears. From the far end of the ward, these sounds blurred together. The occasional clink of a bed frame, the rustle of blankets, the murmured syllables that might have been a name, or perhaps just the fragment of a dream. Other noises joined in. A cough from the next row, a sigh, the faint scrape of nails on the bedpost as someone shifted position, the soft hiss of a breath taken too quickly. The wards amplified small sounds in strange ways. Gas pipes hummed faintly. Floorboards creaked as the building settled. If the wind was right, a loose shutter might knock against the outer wall, and the sound would drift through the hall like a gentle drumbeat. On nights of heavy rain, water drummed steadily on the roof, drowning out the whispers. But in the quiet between storms, the night seemed to listen back. Some attendants swore they could tell the mood of the ward just from the soundscape. Too quiet, and it might mean a shared tension that could erupt by morning. Too noisy, and it meant unsettled dreams, bad tempers, restless bodies. There were patients who called out suddenly in the night, startling even themselves, then rolled over and slept again without a word. Others would sit upright, eyes open, muttering into the dark, before lying back down as if nothing had happened. And there were those whose whispered names were always the same. A husband, a daughter, a friend lost decades ago. These names became part of the ward's nightly chorus, repeated so often they seemed to belong to the place itself. Imagine walking down that long hall at 2 a.m, your lantern casting a slow golden pool on the wooden floor. To your left, a bed rattles briefly as someone turns. To your right, a woman breathes a name into her pillow. Further on, a man murmurs a word you can't quite catch, then falls still. The rhythm of these sounds is as much a part of asylum life as the bells in the day. They are the breath of the building at night, soft, constant, and quietly haunting. And as you pass through, you do not stop them. You simply walk, listening, until the ward door closes gently behind you. In a small, unassuming room near the administrative wing of the asylum, there sat a tall cabinet of drawers and ledgers. No barred windows, no echoing corridors, just a plain desk, an inkwell, and the quiet scratch of a clerk's pen. Here, the life of the asylum was reduced to lines on paper. Every patient, from the newest arrival to those who had lived behind the gates for decades, was recorded in these registers. They were not stories, not portraits, not voices. They were names, ages, occupations, religions, marital statuses, dates of admission, causes of supposed illness, and, eventually, the manner of departure, whether discharged, transferred, or dead. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant, each column neatly ruled, errors rare, and when they occurred, crossed through with a single fine line, so the original entry still whispered beneath the correction. To leaf through these volumes was to walk through the asylum in another way. Here was Mary Ann, aged 34, admitted for melancholia following childbirth. Here was James, aged 52, mania after business failure. Here was Samuel, aged 19, epileptic fits, dangerous. Some entries stretched across several lines, noting special observations, prone to singing in chapel at inappropriate times, speaks to unseen companions daily, refuses meat, requests bread only. The causes of illness reflected the medicine and the prejudices of the time. Under cause, one might read religious excitement, domestic trouble, intemperance, love affair, overstudy, change of life. The euphemisms were as revealing as the blunt terms. A widow described as grief-stricken might, today, be understood as suffering depression. A young woman listed as hysterical could have been resisting an unwanted marriage. A man with exhaustion might have worked himself into breakdown in a factory or mine. For each entry, there was also the assigned diagnosis: mania, melancholia, idiocy, imbecility. Later, more refined terms appeared: recurrent mania, senile dementia, delusional insanity. The language shifted over decades, but the impulse to categorize remained. What was most striking was the sheer permanence of the names. Some were marked discharged, recovered within months. Others stayed for years, even decades, their departure recorded only in the column for deaths. For those, a brief note: died of consumption, died of apoplexy, died suddenly, heart. The registers did not grieve. They did not speak of friendships formed, of moments of clarity, of garden work or music in the halls. They recorded only the barest facts, yet within those facts lived entire unseen lives. The staff, too, were documented: nurses, attendants, cooks, clerks, pay scales, dates of hiring, disciplinary notes, dismissed for negligence, commended for service. Even the matron's name appeared, renewed in each annual roll. In the winter months, the registers grew heavier with new entries. Cold, hunger, and hardship outside the walls drove many to breakdown. The clerk worked longer hours then, filling line after line in the same measured hand, blotting the ink with sand before closing the book each night. To modern eyes, these registers are historical records. To the asylum, they were the spine of its memory. They justified budgets. They informed reports to the Board of Visitors. They proved, in their own way, that the institution was doing its work. But for those who lived within these walls, the register was something else entirely. It was the silent witness that held their name long after their own voice had faded. Imagine now the clerk, pausing between entries, dipping his pen into the dark ink. He glances at the next name on the admission slip, at the neat, looping handwriting of the referring physician. He writes it carefully into the book, draws a ruler down to mark the columns, and moves on to the next. Outside, a bell rings for supper. The wards stir. The pen continues to scratch quietly across the paper. In this room, the asylum speaks only in ink, and the pages keep turning. Every Victorian asylum had gates. They might be grand wrought iron hung between stone pillars, or simpler timber gates bound in black iron straps. Whatever their design, They marked the boundary between two worlds, inside and outside, confinement and freedom. To most patients, these gates were simply part of the landscape, always there, always closed. But to a few, they were a challenge, and to the staff assigned as gatekeepers, they were a constant responsibility. Escapes were rare, but they happened. The most common were not elaborate breakouts, but quiet walkaways, a patient sent to fetch something from the laundry, or allowed into the garden, who simply kept walking. The asylum grounds could be sprawling, with winding paths, outbuildings, and fields. By the time an absence was noticed, the patient might be well beyond the outer walls. Some attempts were bolder. A patient might scale a garden wall using a stacked bench or a tree branch. Another might slip out behind a delivery cart. There were even stories, half fact, half legend, of patients disguising themselves in attendant uniforms to pass through the gates unnoticed. The gatekeepers knew these stories well. They were not just guards but observers, positioned at the entrance lodge or the main gatehouse. They recognized staff and patients by face, even at a distance. They watched for the subtle signs of a bolter, a nervous glance, a hurried step, a reluctance to meet the eye. Deliveries were a busy time. Carts bringing coal, milk, bread, or supplies entered through the gate under the keeper's watch. Each was inspected, its driver checked against the day's expected visitors. A patient might linger nearby, pretending to sweep or carry tools, waiting for the moment when the gate swung wide. The keeper's job was to notice everything without appearing suspicious. They might stand leaning on the gatepost, pipe in hand, chatting idly with a passing gardener, but their eyes were always scanning. When an escape did happen, a bell was rung short, sharp strikes that carried across the grounds. Staff converged, spreading out along the roads and hedgerows, checking nearby fields, searching footpaths that led toward the village. Sometimes the search ended quickly. Other times it stretched into hours, even days. Some escapees were caught within sight of the asylum, walking calmly along the verge of the road as though nothing were amiss. Others made it to the railway station, where a station master might recognize them and send word back. A few disappeared entirely, their fate unknown. When returned, escapees were rarely punished harshly, though their privileges were withdrawn, and they might be moved to a more secure ward. The asylum understood that escape attempts were often driven less by cunning than by desperation. Still, each incident was carefully recorded in the daybook, its details written in the same calm hand as any other report. The gatekeepers were not only defenders against escape, they were also the first point of contact for visitors. Relatives arrived at the lodge to present their visiting orders. Their names entered into the gatekeeper's ledger. Vendors, contractors, clergy, all passed under the keeper's eye. In this way, the gatekeeper was both sentinel and host, firm in his duties, but capable of courtesy. For the asylum, he was the filter between worlds. There is a quiet image often remembered by former attendants. The keeper standing at the gate on a bright afternoon, keys in one hand, cap set squarely on his head, watching a small group approach along the road. He waits until they are close enough to be recognized. If they are visitors, he nods and opens the gate. If they are not, he stands still until they turn away. Inside, life continues. Outside, the world moves on, and between them, the gate stays closed. More than a century has passed since the height of the Victorian Asylum. Many of the buildings still stand, but they no longer serve the purpose for which they were built. Some have been repurposed, their long corridors turned into apartment blocks, offices, or schools. Others have been left to fall into slow decay, their brickwork cracked, their windows boarded, their gardens overgrown. The grandest asylums, once symbols of civic pride, were often built to last. Their stone facades still rise above the landscape, even when the rest has been stripped bare. In certain towns, the central tower of the old asylum remains a landmark, its clock long stopped, its bell silent, but still visible from miles away. Step closer to the abandoned ones, and you'll find the traces of their former life. Weather-worn signs still fixed to walls. Admission ward, laundry, kitchen block. Faded paint marks where numbers once identified doors and cupboards. Rusty iron brackets where gas lamps were mounted, the glass long gone. If you're quiet, you might even hear the sound of pigeons nesting in the roof voids, their wings echoing faintly in the emptiness. In some places, demolition crews have come and gone, leaving only fragments, an archway here, a section of boundary wall there. These remnants look almost decorative now, as though they were always meant to be quaint features in a park or housing estate. But once, they were part of a working world with strict routines and unyielding boundaries. Other sites have been carefully preserved, restored for new purposes. Converted asylums often carry a curious duality, beautiful architecture married to a history many would rather forget. You can walk through a gleaming lobby and still sense the proportions of the old administrative hall. You might live in a modern flat and know that your kitchen was once a ward office, or that the wide corridor outside your door once saw the passage of laundry carts and meal trolleys. For those that became hospitals, much has changed, but some things remain. You might still find the original tiled staircases, the tall sash windows, the iron radiators. The grounds may still carry the geometry of the old gardens, straight paths flanked by shrubs, circular beds where flowers once bloomed for patients' walks. In the fully abandoned sites, nature slowly reclaims the ground. Ivy twists up the brickwork, pushing into window frames. Grass grows in the cracks of the courtyard paving. Trees sprout from places they were never meant to grow, rooftops, gutters, even the tops of chimney stacks. The once clear garden walks are now narrow tunnels through bramble and nettle. Inside, decay is measured in small signs, peeling paint curling away from plaster like dry leaves, floors warped from water damage, ceilings collapsed under the weight of rot. And yet, in the middle of it all, there might be a perfectly intact door frame, still painted the same institutional green it wore a century ago. For those who worked or lived there, visiting these ruins can be unsettling. The familiar scale of the corridors, the echo of footsteps on hard floors, the way light filters in through high windows, it all remains, but stripped of purpose. No staff, no patients, no sound of meal bells or laundry carts, just the building holding its silence. In rare cases, archives and local historians have fought to save pieces of these sites. Furniture is restored and placed in museums. Photographs are mounted on community boards. Fragments of ledgers, uniforms, and medical tools are kept in climate-controlled rooms. These artifacts are small, but they preserve the texture of a world otherwise fading into memory. The public today sees Victorian asylums with a mix of fascination and unease. They are often the subject of heritage tours, art projects, and less seriously ghost hunts. For some, they are symbols of outdated medicine. For others, they are monuments to a moment in history when society tried, in its own flawed way, to care for the most vulnerable. Imagine now walking the empty hallway of such a place. The air smells of dust and cold stone. Your footsteps echo and fade. Light from a broken window casts patterns on the floorboards where once patients paced. You pass a doorway, its sign barely legible. Female Ward B. Beyond it, only silence. The building waits, as though time has stopped. It no longer holds the lives it once contained, but its walls remember. And in those memories, the asylum still breathes quietly, persistently through its ruins and remnants. When the last patients left, and the gates of the Victorian asylum closed for good, much of its story faded with them. The wards went quiet. The gardens grew untended. The clock in the tower stopped. But perhaps the most quietly erased were the people who had worked there. Not the doctors whose names appear in annual reports, but the many others whose lives were shaped by the place. They were the attendants who rose before dawn to light the ward fires, and the nurses who walked the same corridors for 30 years. They were the kitchen workers who peeled mountains of potatoes each day, the laundry women who worked in the heat and steam without complaint, the gardeners who coaxed life from the soil in neat rows. Few left written accounts. Their stories survive mostly in paybooks, census records, or the faint notes they made in patient logs. The work they did was ordinary in the sense that it was done every day without fanfare, but it was extraordinary in its constancy. To work in a Victorian asylum was to live by its clock, to fit your own life between the hours it demanded. Many lived on the grounds, in small cottages or attic rooms, their personal and working worlds only steps apart. Days off were rare, holidays even rarer, and yet they built entire lives within those walls. Some met their spouses there, two attendants whose duties crossed during kitchen deliveries, or a gardener and a nurse who exchanged nods at the gate. Children of staff grew up in the shadow of the building, playing along the outer paths, sometimes helping in the gardens or laundry as they got older. The daily work required patience above all else. An attendant might spend hours coaxing a patient to take a few steps outdoors. A nurse might sit beside a bed in silence, mending linen while keeping watch. The measure of success was often invisible. A day without incident, a small improvement in mood, the quiet return of a patient from the garden without prompting. There was a camaraderie among the workers, even across ranks. The night keeper passing the laundry maid on her way to the morning wash. The matron nodding to the gardener who had brought her fresh-cut flowers for her office. These were small gestures, but they kept the machine of the asylum running more smoothly than the formal rules ever could. There were also tensions. Staff turnover could be high. Newcomers sometimes found the work too heavy, the hours too long, the wards too oppressive. But for those who stayed, the building became a kind of second home. They learned its moods the way the wards felt just before a storm, the way winter light made the day rooms seem closer, the way certain corridors carried sound differently depending on the hour. When the asylums began to close in the 20th century, many of these workers simply moved on to other institutions, general hospitals, care homes, local councils. Others retired quietly, their years of service marked only by a small pension and perhaps a farewell tea in the staff hall. No monuments were built for them. No plaques carry their names. Their legacy is in the memories of those who passed through the buildings while they still lived and worked there. Today, when one visits the remains of a Victorian asylum, it is easy to think first of the patients, their struggles, their treatment, their confinement. But the silence that lingers also belongs to the staff, to the hundreds, sometimes thousands, who kept the place alive through routine, diligence, and presence. They left no speeches, no manifestos, only the quiet imprint of their work. Imagine now walking through an overgrown garden path where the stones are still neatly laid beneath the grass. A low brick wall, once tended, crumbles gently at the edge. You pass what was once the laundry yard, where steam rose into the winter air, and the old greenhouse, glass long gone, where herbs were grown for the kitchen. You picture the hands that worked here, scrubbing, mending, planting, carrying day after day, year after year. The asylum is gone, but the rhythm they kept still hums faintly in the air. It is a legacy made of silence, not ceremony. One you can feel if you stand still long enough, and when you leave, you carry it with you quietly, as they once did. And so we come to the end of our long walk through the corridors of the Victorian asylum. We have stepped softly past the wards, the gardens, the chapel. We have looked into storerooms and kitchens, into the matron's office and the silent observation rooms. We have listened to the whispers of patients in the night and the slow scrape of brushes along wooden floors. We have seen the iron gates, the heavy registers, the silent clocks. It has been a world of routine days divided by bells, meals, and cleaning rounds. a place where time was not measured so much in hours as in repeated acts, unlocking a door, lighting a fire, folding a blanket, pouring tea, where healing was sought not only through medicine, but through structure, fresh air, music, and work in the soil. We have met the quiet figures who kept this world running, the attendants walking their night rounds, the nurses tending to patients with unspoken care, the gardeners coaxing green life from the earth, the cooks stirring the great pots in the kitchens before dawn. They did their work in a place heavy with rules and boundaries, but also with moments of stillness, small pockets of humanity that softened the hardness of the institution. The asylum was not only its buildings, it was its people. It was the endless patience of those who stayed, the resilience of those who lived behind its walls, and the stories both spoken and unspoken that passed between them. It was a community built in confinement, with its own rhythms and customs, its own quiet bonds. Now, in our own time, most of these asylums have fallen silent. Some are gone entirely, replaced by houses, offices, or open fields. Others still stand repurposed, restored, or left to crumble slowly into their own history. The air inside them is still, the walls cool to the touch, the corridors echoing only with the sound of your own steps. But if you pause, you can almost hear it again, the low murmur of voices in the day room, the clink of cups in the staff tea room, the slow, even tread of the matron making her rounds, the rustle of wind through the garden hedges where patients once walked in the sun. It is all still there, in memory, not loud, not demanding just a soft undercurrent, like a tide that never fully goes out. So, as we close this long day in the asylum, let the sound of those corridors fade gently. Let the last chime of the ward bell dissolve into silence. Imagine the beds neatly made, the fires banked low, the night watch beginning its quiet vigil. Outside, the gardens lie still beneath the stars, the iron gates closed, the windows dark. And here, in your own quiet, you can rest. The long journey is done. The doors are locked, the lamps turned down. The voices fade, leaving only calm. Time moves slowly here, as if inviting you to drift away with it. And you may. The night is patient. It will keep watch for you now,